Welcome to Talking Foreign Policy. I'm Michael Scharf, Associate Dean at Case Western Reserve University School of Law. Today, our experts will be discussing the prospects and obstacles for trials of the Assad regime. If you're joining this program for the first time, the format we use is sort of a radio version of the McLaughlin Group. Our panel consists of a judge who prosecuted Saddam Hussein, the international prosecutor who tried Charles Taylor, one of the world's leading military ethicists, and the president of an NGO which has been tasked with laying the groundwork for transitional justice in post-Assad Syria. We'll start our conversation with Judge Raid Juhi, al-Saedi. I first met Judge Raid in 2004 when I helped train the judges for the Saddam Hussein trial. After that, Judge Raid spent a year as the distinguished jurist in residence at Case Western Reserve Law School. He's joining us today from Austin, Texas. Judge, thanks for being on Talking Foreign Policy.
Oh, Mike, thank you very much. Thank you for having me with you.
So, Judge Raid, you've witnessed firsthand the difficulties of trying a tyrant. Assuming that the Assad regime actually falls, and assuming that Assad is captured alive, like Saddam Hussein, where do you think he would end up being prosecuted?
Actually, in the beginning, maybe it would say how many options he has if he arrested, and captures is alive. Is he has an option to try inside or outside? I think if he's smart enough, sure, he would like to go to the International Tribunal or ICC to prosecute there. Because if he go there, there are several positive points for him there. 100% he does not face the death penalty with the International Tribunal or ICC. And he also can hire, international lawyer, counselors, and he has several other points with this trial.
Now, Judge Raid, if he's captured in Syria, the choice won't really be his. But what you're suggesting is if he can get out of Syria, then some other country might be more willing to surrender him to an international tribunal than to have him be prosecuted by the Syrians themselves.
Yeah, this is the thing I just like to realize now when I said, but this option, I said this option maybe is not on table because to send an Assad to the outside the Syria, it's not easy thing. And also there is two things here. If he sent it to any international tribunal, they should go through the Security Council. And everybody knows now there is disagreement inside the Security Council with the UN issues about the Syrian thing. Second thing, which is very important, who has the power? Who control the ground in Syria? Who can make the decision to prosecute al-Assad? And now we have very good example about Saif al-Islam al-Qaddafi in Libya. He is wanted from the ICC, but the Libyan government, when they arrested him, they insist to prosecute him inside the Libya with the Libyan law. So I think it's up to the Syrian people if they arrested al-Assad alive. So I'm sure they will insist to prosecute him according to the Syrian law. But also he will fight back to find any international tribunal or international standard, or maybe he will run away and get arrested out of the Syria.
Now, Judge, let's assume he is arrested in Syria. A minute ago, you mentioned the death penalty. Now, when you were involved in the trial of Saddam Hussein, I remember your colleagues decided to have the death penalty for Saddam Hussein and the other members of the Ba'ath regime that were prosecuted. And that was fairly controversial. As I recall, the United Nations and the UK decided that they couldn't support the Iraqi High Tribunal because it had the death penalty. Do you think that the Syrians, if they go forward with a domestic trial, will insist on the availability of the death penalty?
The situation in Syria, actually, it's 100% now is different than Iraq. It's in Iraq, yes, we don't have that time. It's the support from the UN, but at least we have international community, US with us that time, and they support us. And here's the thing. Simply, Syrian people will insist to have death penalty because still they have death penalty in Syrian law. And if they want to abolish the death penalty, they need to change the law. And so that means they have to pass another law or another order from the, the government. That's lead us or back us to the same thing, same question in the beginning. It's who will control? It's most of the Syrian, fighters now. Some of these guys is, Islamic radicals people there, and they believe in Sharia law and Islamic law, and it's as you understand, Mike, it's a Sharia law. It's mentioned. It's eye for eye, and it's this thing is so difficult. So I think it's they will insist to have the death penalty because at least until now there is a lot of civilian got killed by the regime. So to bring al-Assad to a justice, people think maybe he will face the death penalty at least, and that's depend on the legal system there. But Syrian people, they will insist to have death penalty in their law, because I spoke with some of these guys, and until this minute I see many of these people insist to have the death penalty with their legal system. But at the same time, if they insist on this point, they will face bigger problem. They will find the UN, many NGOs cannot help them because of the death penalty. And at the same time, if they don't have, one of the biggest, countries can help, maybe they cannot go over all the transitional justice things. So it's kind of balance.
Now let me ask you another question, Judge Raid. When you were involved in the trial of Saddam Hussein, there was a decision to actually televise that trial. And as it resulted, Saddam was able to propagandize his followers and exhort them to resort to violence. Do you think that the Syrians are going to follow the Iraqi example, not just in the death penalty, but also in televising the trial if they actually have a trial of Assad?
It's both ways. Have, televise the trial and don't televise the trial. Both ways has positive and negative points. As we saw in Iraq, in Iraq we had different things, and when we decide to put the trial on TV, we had at that time several messages we like to send it. The first message we had to deliver, this is the first trial in the Middle East for the head of the state. This is one of the biggest things in the Middle East in that time. The second thing, we had the second message. This is the rule of law in Iraq. This is a new rule of law in Iraq. But it's and we think we succeed in these messages, both messages, because now, as we see, we have a trial in Egypt. There is a trial for ex-president of Egypt, Mohammed Hosni Mubarak, and there is a trial in Libya about Saif al-Islam al-Qaddafi. And we think, and also people now ask to prosecute ex-president of Tunisia. That's all. This is the positive impact of this trial of Saddam Hussein. But here's the thing. Maybe the Syrian people like to avoid the negative things. So maybe if al-Assad got arrested and put the trial on TV, he will use the TV to send and deliver messages to his fellow and supporters. So maybe they will pick midway, the Egyptian way, I can say. They put trial, set up all the trial, but they don't televise all the trial 100%. Maybe they will send minutes or couple minutes, from the trial during the news or something like that for the public. But televise all the trial, maybe it's hard for them.
That sounds
so.
Like,
I think they will go over.
That might be a good compromise. Let me ask you another question though. So when the trial of Saddam Hussein was televised, we here in the West saw it translated into English, and we got to watch all the crazy days of that trial. And there was a lot of criticism about not just the trial, but also about the execution. How was the Saddam trial perceived in Iraq? Because I have a hunch that we looked at it through our own Western eyes, but it's not necessarily the way that the Iraqis saw it.
Let me put this in different things. Maybe Yes, we get a lot of criticism, and there is a lot of issues happen in the trial. But first of all, let me say this: it's most of the international communities try to criticize Iraq, and we ask them in the beginning to join us, to help us, to support us, to observe us, to follow the international standards. But most of these just step away and step out from us, and they left us to work alone with some colleagues from the international standards, international community. So this is one thing. The second thing, we are in Iraq. We look at through our history. Actually, it's yes, we have to look through the international history also, but we focusing on our history. In 1958, when the military coup happened in Iraq, they killed all the monarchy's family, and they killed the king and his family and the children without a trial. Then, 5 years later, 1963, same thing happened. They execute Abdul Karim Qasim without any trial, and they throw his body in the river, and no one knows where's the body now. There is no grave for him. But in Saddam's trial, as everybody watched at that time, we had long process, investigation and trial. It's almost 3 years, a process, and everybody has an access by the media and by the data, and many verdicts now published also, and it's available Arabic and English. At the same time, how Iraqis look at the trial of Saddam Hussein right now, I hear there is a lot of requests now sent to the Iraqi parliament to reestablish IHT or a court like IHT.
And that's the Iraqi High Tribunal that prosecuted Saddam.
Yeah, Iraqi High Tribunal. Yeah, it's to reestablish this kind of court, because this kind of court it has strong personnel, strong process, and they have faith in the rule of law, and it's really brought a justice on the ground in Iraq. So now many people in Iraq start to ask the Iraqi parliament to reestablish kind of this court to face the perpetrators, to bring the perpetrator to the justice, because as everybody see, there is a lot of violence in Iraq and corruption, and kind of the corruption and violence connected with the high value people. So now Iraqi people start again to ask about this kind of court. That's also, it's very, very important thing that's happening in Iraq. So many Iraqi people think now this court is strong enough, it's fair enough to prosecute ex-regime.
And I think what you're telling us is that we often have to remember that we're looking at a court system that's very different from that in the United States when we're trying to judge a foreign trial. But we're almost out of time for this segment. I just want to say, Judge Raid, to our viewers that I have heard that you've been involved in helping to set up the legal infrastructure for the prosecution of Assad, and that you will be an advisor during that. And I think they're in very good hands with somebody who has such intimate experience with the pros and cons of trying a major tyrant. Thank you so much for being with us from Austin, Texas, and I'll look forward to seeing you again soon. Now, everybody else, please stay with us while we continue our discussion after this break of justice for the Assad regime. Welcome back to Talking Foreign Policy, brought to you by Case Western Reserve University and WCPN 90.3 Idea Stream. I'm Michael Scharf, and for this segment, I'm joined in studio by Shannon French, the director of the Inamori International Center for Ethics and Excellence. In addition, we'll be talking with Paul Williams, president of the Public International Law and Policy Group, who's coming to us from our affiliate in Washington, D.C., and we'll be bringing in David Crane, the former chief prosecutor of the Special Court for Sierra Leone, who's in Asheville, North Carolina. Now, at the top of the hour, Judge Raid Juhi, the Chief Investigative Judge of the Saddam Hussein Trial, gave us some insights based on his experience about the difficulty of trying the leaders of the Assad regime. David Crane has been leading an effort to collect and collate the evidence against the Assad regime in Syria and to map out what indictments might look like. David, can you tell us about what you've been doing in this regard?
Certainly, Michael, and it's a real pleasure to be with you all and my colleagues. Right now, the Syrian Accountability Project out of Syracuse University College of Law, sponsored by Impunity Watch, No Peace Without Justice, and other affiliated NGOs, have been, since the tragedy began, been mapping the conflict, and we can talk about what that means. We've also been building a crime-based matrix, along with an indictment matrix and sample indictments related to, and as examples for, a potential Syrian prosecutor or a regional prosecutor or an international prosecutor. What essentially the motive was when I was prosecuting in West Africa, I would have loved to have been able to have a package which laid out the conflict, offered some suggestions related to crimes that were committed, and then be able to consider them and then to move forward. So what this is building a package with the assistance of the Public International Law Policy Group, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and other NGOs to develop this in a way that is useful to whoever has the portfolio to prosecute Assad if he survives the transition, and others who have perpetrated such atrocity on the people of Syria.
Well, it's good to know that the NGOs, led by you and others, are ahead of the curve this time rather than playing catch-up. Now, exactly, Dave, what types of evidence have you been examining, and where is it coming from?
Well, the way you do this is that you look at it holistically and begin to gather evidence from whatever source it may be. You're not building a trial-ready case. What you're doing is you're just taking what we would call criminal information and data, and in a systematic way, putting it into what we call a crime base, categorizing each and every alleged event, the perpetrator, the location, how many people were killed, potential allegations, where it took place, what have you. And we now have a crime-based matrix that is almost 220 pages long of just incidents. And that doesn't mean that they all happened, but we have a chronology that allows then, as you look at this, and it jumps right out at you, the more grievous crimes, the crimes that need to be prosecuted. And then what we pull from that, we go and develop a indictment matrix where we look at those particular crimes that are particularly heinous that need to be prosecuted. So at this point in time, what we're doing is gathering criminal information and then putting it together in a systematic way so that future considerations can be had related to what crimes we do want to prosecute. Because at the end of the day, as we know, you can't prosecute every crime. You can't hold everybody accountable. You have to representationally pick those crimes against humanity and war crimes that need to be charged based on the egregiousness of it. But right now, it's amazing. When we started in 2001, 2002 to build our case against Charles Taylor and those who were doing the Blood Diamond story, we didn't have this ability to gather this information. In some cases, our biggest challenge, and I'm sure my colleagues can echo this, is that we almost have too much information because it's coming in from all over the world, from directly Syria and others. And it's the challenge, actually, Mike, is to put all of this data in a way that's understandable. And so it's a fascinating difference, but 10 years ago, that with the social media and the ability to upload pictures and video as well as direct testimony, the challenge is just the amount of information.
So, David, can you give us a little bit of a preview based on what you're seeing? What exact international crimes do you think are being committed, and who besides Assad are committing them?
Well, we have a conflict. It is what one probably would classify at this point a non-international armed conflict. The international humanitarian law does apply. We have numerous violations of IHL, as we call it. Certainly, war crimes are being committed, but also crimes against humanity, which does not need to have a conflict. It's just a widespread or systematic direct attack on civilians, and certainly Assad is certainly doing that. So in a general sense, we're seeing war crimes and crimes against humanity perpetrated not only by the Assad regime, but the challenge here is, and it's a political twist, and as we've chatted before, Mike, the bright red thread of a lot of this is politics, is that we're seeing all sides now because of the length and the atrocities that are being committed by the Assad regime. Both sides are getting frustrated, and we're seeing war crimes and crimes against, or excuse me, just war crimes being committed by both the Free Syrian Army, militias that are attached to that, or militias that are not attached to that, along with the Syrian Army. The sad thing is it is in any of these dirty little wars, is that civilians are bearing the brunt of this atrocity, and we're seeing that happen every day.
Now let me bring Paul Williams into the conversation. Paul, you recently chaired a meeting of transitional justice experts and members of the Syrian opposition in Istanbul to prepare for, quote, the day after. And Judge Raid and I were privileged to be there. As I understand it, the focus has been on creating a domestic tribunal with international assistance. Judge Raid mentioned that Assad may want to go to an international court, but why, Paul, is the focus on the domestic trial rather than sending him to the International Criminal Court?
Well, Michael, I think to be frank, the people of Syria don't need the international community to hold Assad accountable for war crimes. They can do it themselves. The Syrian people have the capacity to conduct domestic trials. Whenever they do apprehend Assad, they'll have a functioning court system. They'll have the structure to do it. And I think right now you have a large section of Syria that is liberated, the courts are operating, and they have in custody individuals who are suspected of committing war crimes. Our energies should be put behind the Syrian people. And then also a corollary, Michael, the international community simply doesn't deserve to prosecute Assad and others responsible for war crimes. The international community has failed to take the field, has failed to take the right action, and this shouldn't be a trial that the international community uses and says, look, see, we did something, we tried Assad. This is the Syrian people fighting for their liberation, fighting for democracy, and they deserve the opportunity to hold those individuals who are committing mass murder accountable.
Now, that's a really thought-provoking statement. Let me bring in our resident ethicist, Shannon French, to chime in on this. Shannon, do you think it would be better to prosecute Assad and his other leaders in an international court, or do you agree with Paul and Judge Raid that it probably needs to be domestic?
Well, I think Paul raises a really fascinating point because at this stage, the jury is very much still out about the UN's commitment to what they call the responsibility to protect, or in shorthand, R2P. And I think there are many people in many corners of the globe who are genuinely interested in seeing if that has any teeth, and have looked at the UN as an organization that hasn't backed up its commitments effectively. So in this case, on the one hand, I think there is a strong argument for the international community to be able to try Assad in an international court in order for it to collectively assert responsibility and hold leaders accountable in a way that says we, the entire world, are condemning this individual. And yet, I think balancing against that is the very point that Paul raises, which is, do they have the right to do that if they have not, in fact, intervened in any useful and effective way? Have they, in fact, ceded the right to perhaps take credit for condemning him if they haven't helped in bringing him to justice?
And, of course, Judge Raid adds that unless Assad escapes out of Syria, if the Syrian opposition has custody over him, they're going to want to prosecute. So that leads to this question for Paul. Assuming that he is captured and he's alive and the Syrians are going to prosecute him, what needs to be done to set up a domestic trial there that's effective and fair?
Well, Michael, in order for there to be an effective and fair trial in Syria, the Syrians and the international community who will support them have to be serious about accountability. And so there's two key things that have to be put in place in order to have effective and fair trials. The first is there has to be a bar against amnesties. We're going to see a lot of pressure with the recent Kerry initiative and Russian initiative by the Russians and by some of our European allies pushing for an amnesty in order to facilitate the peace process. That has to be kept off the table. It will undermine the legitimacy of domestic trials. The second is we have to be serious about culling war criminals from the governing structure. It can't be a token one or two individuals. It has to be those regime officials which are responsible for the most serious crimes. And it should look at international actors who've been supplying weapons to the regime and to the al-Qaeda elements in Syria. If we're going to do domestic trials, they're only fair, they're only effective if we're actually serious about it.
When you say international actors, Paul, are you referring to Iran?
Well, there are a number of international states, as well as other non-state actors who have provided weapons, who've provided other types of resources, financial and otherwise. And I think that, all of that should be on the table. There should be an accounting for those who enabled Assad to commit this mass murder against his civilians.
And just reading between the lines, now you're also referring to Russia? Is that correct?
You're pretty good at reading between the lines, aren't you, Michael? Look, this guy, Assad, is committing mass murder against his people. He's getting fresh supplies of weapons, ammunition, money. There's all kinds of, and David can map this out for you, there's all kinds of ways under conspiracy, joint criminal enterprise. It's not just the individual who's ordering or pulling the trigger. It's those who enable him or her, in some instances, to commit these crimes against humanity that are also culpable. And what I'm saying is they have to be held liable as well.
It's interesting you mentioned David Crane because David has written about the fact that when he was prosecuting Charles Taylor, he thought seriously about also prosecuting Muammar Gaddafi, but that international politics would have made that very difficult. David, what's your take on going after Russians and Iranians as well as members of the Assad regime here?
Part of the Syrian Accountability Project is looking at the civil side of all of this and looking at other actors as well as their criminal liability. Again, when you have these dirty little wars, these non-international armed conflicts, it's not just the actors within the territory of the country. Fascinating is there are many individuals and organizations and companies and countries that are involved in bringing destruction upon whoever that may be. And that's happening in Syria as well. And we've done a study and have found that there are a dozen entities which have criminal culpability. The challenge being on the civil side of the house is jurisdiction and standing and all of that. But yes, we've been looking very carefully at that. That is possible, but we're at a very cutting edge of the law. I think that it has to move in that direction because, again, it's not just a particular regime or dictator or thug that is bringing atrocities upon his own people, but he's backed by a myriad of actors. And so we need to be working on that. And we very closely looked at the possibility of other types of entities in Sierra Leone, which at least aided and abetted, but certainly sustained 10 years of horror, and that's exactly what's playing out in Syria as well. It's a fascinating legal theory. I think we need to take that on. We have been considering and looking at culpability in our crime-based matrix of those actors so that should there be, and I agree with Paul, should the Syrians or an internationalized Syrian court begin the process, they need to consider those entities that are outside but who had a direct and specific involvement in the perpetration of war crimes and crimes against humanity.
Now, the two of you have been advocating for pretty broad prosecutions, and Judge Rod mentioned earlier that the Assad regime, with all of its atrocities, has engendered so much hatred by the opposition that they're going to insist on the death penalty. Let me bring Shannon in and ask, what are going to be the challenges of having a fair trial under these circumstances, and what are the pros and cons of having the death penalty?
Well, the death penalty is a very controversial punishment internationally. And in fact, the U.S. is sort of on the minority side in terms of being generally positive about the death penalty. But the reason for that is complicated. The purposes of punishment are not agreed upon internationally. There are many different perspectives. And for some, the idea of the death penalty falls into the category of vengeance, not justice. They see it as not an effective deterrent or not any more effective than other punishments. And they don't see it as therefore gaining anything for the long term or for future preventing future crimes. But the problem with outsiders judging that is they're not the direct victims. And we've heard about the kinds of atrocities that are being committed and the kinds of victims that have been created by this regime. And they may argue that this is not a matter of vengeance. It's a question of the actual just deserts that fit with particularly extreme crimes. And that to not have the death penalty on the table is to minimize those crimes and to suggest that the victims are somehow not being given their full weight and dignity and respect. And so that's where it becomes a problem on an ethical level. Is the death penalty ever appropriate? And if it is, if you answer yes to that question, how could this not qualify?
And Paul, let me ask you this. With or without the death penalty, how in the world can they guarantee fair trials for Assad and the other military and political leaders that have committed these heinous things that Shannon is referring to?
Well, I think we oftentimes tend to look at the sort of the atrocity mindset of the perpetrators and then assume that that'll be reflected by the victims. I've worked very closely with many Syrian opposition groups, those fighting for democracy. They believe in free and fair trial. They believe in due process. They want to hold Assad accountable for the atrocities that he's committed. And they want to do it in a free and fair way, in a way that lays the foundation for democracy. This is not two equal parties fighting against each other. This is a group of protesters who've tried to change Syria to a democratic regime, and they've been met with crimes against humanity, the slaughter of 70,000 civilians. They're still fighting for democracy. And a free and fair trial with these safeguards you talk about for the perpetrators of this carnage, that's part of the path of getting Syria back onto democracy. And the Syrians that I'm working with or have talked to and have engaged with are committed to that. That's why they're fighting this revolution.
And David's suggesting that not only the Assad regime, but at least a couple of cases against the military commanders in the opposition for war crimes. Is that right, David?
Yes, and again, it's very important that justice needs to be done, and so we have to look at everyone, because again, if not, then equal justice is not being done. So if the Syrian people realize that this is being done in a fair and open manner, that all perpetrators are being looked at, I think that lays a very important groundwork for justice to move forward.
All right, so it's time for another very short break. Please stay tuned for the conclusion of our discussion of the day after Assad in just a moment. We're back with Talking Foreign Policy. This is Michael Scharf, Associate Dean at Case Western Reserve University School of Law. With me in studio is ethicist Shannon French, and we're joined from D.C. by Paul Williams of the Public International Law and Policy Group, and from Asheville, North Carolina, by David Crane, the former Chief Prosecutor of the Special Court for Sierra Leone. We've been discussing the prospects and problems of prosecuting the Assad regime, assuming that it's toppled in the months ahead. And Paul, that's really a big assumption that we've been going by. Do you think the Assad regime will actually fall?
Yes. Michael, if the United States government and its allies do the right thing in the immediate future to stop these atrocities, the regime will fall. It's only being held up by the Russians and by the Iranians. As Shannon mentioned earlier, there's a substantial push for humanitarian action under responsibility to protect. We have an obligation to engage, to do the right thing. And also, quite frankly, it is in our core national strategic interest. Because America and its allies have failed to engage, al-Qaeda has engaged, and they're the heroes of this story for so many people. So I don't think the Americans can sit on their hands for very long. They're going to have to engage.
Now, Paul, you and I have both done a lot of work in Libya. In fact, you were there during the Benghazi incident. And I would like to ask you, with respect to what you were just saying about the U.S. failure to do more, in what ways is this situation in Syria different from Libya in 2011? Why were we able to engage politically, militarily, back then for Libya, but we don't seem to have our act together for Syria?
There was strong leadership by our French allies and our other European allies, and that brought us into the field. I think what is important here is when we look at Libya vis-a-vis Syria, it's really night and day vis-a-vis our strategic interests. In Libya, the Americans, NATO, are the heroes. There are issues. Al-Qaeda is trying to get a foothold in Libya, but in Libya it's on the path to democracy, and it's been put on that path with the assistance of America and its allies. They have a genuine prospect for democracy there. Our strategic interests are being protected. In Syria, as I mentioned, it's the al-Qaeda who's the heroes. They've taken the field. Syria is empowering al-Qaeda in the same way that Afghanistan empowered them. And if we don't engage, if we don't begin to protect our strategic interests, there's going to be substantial consequences in the coming years.
Well, let me ask Shannon this question then. Why doesn't the Obama administration get it? Why are they doing not the kinds of things that Paul says they should be in Syria?
Well, there's significant both domestic and international pressures against, just as there are pressures for. And in this case, what we did in Libya angered and irritated the Russians, and they are now reacting in light of that even more strongly against intervention in Syria, although we are addressing that diplomatically. And so there's a reflection of their feeling that we overreached or did more than they thought we were going to do in Libya. And so they are expressing mistrust if we say we're going to intervene in a limited way in Syria. Domestically, this administration inherited these extensive military commitments, but it would much rather focus on domestic issues, and this is politics. They want to focus on jobs and healthcare and so forth, and it is not something that I hate to put it this way, but plays well back in the domestic audience to be focused externally in this way. There's this language what we hear of the red line being crossed when Syria uses chemical weapons against its own civilians. And I think what you saw in response was this definite reluctance to acknowledge that line truly being crossed because of the commitment that would imply and because of the shadow of Iraq. They are fearful that this will be compared to the claims about WMD in Iraq. And if any of it turns out not to be true, as it turned out not to be true in the Iraqi case, then this administration will suffer again politically. However, the evidence isn't the same.
Let me interrupt you there about the evidence. So, David, you're sitting there in your office in Syracuse shifting through all the publicly available evidence. Have they or have they not found evidence of chemical weapon use? What's the story there?
Well, you know, it is a interesting question because I think that they do have it. They just don't want to mouth the words because, unfortunately, when like in anything in life, if you draw a line, someone is going to cross it, and they have the capacity. We do know intelligence assets in the United States have confirmed that it has been done, but it has now become a political problem for the Obama administration because we did draw the red line. They did use a limited amount of sarin gas. We do have casualties. We do have the evidence. But at the end of the day, as Shannon said, we have a political balance to this. And the American people at this point are not looking for the U.S. to lead an international effort to stop the use of chemical weapons.
But David, would it be a different case if there was evidence of massive use of chemical weapons where you had massive atrocities and deaths?
Yes, because again, the international community has to say we have got to put that genie back in the bottle. If we allow a mass use of any weapon of mass destruction, then we do have to act
So
at many
where's that
levels.
line? Is that at 1,000 people, 500 people?
I have to
don't
say, I'm
have-
sure the Syrian resistance is feeling that those lines have been crossed a long time ago, and would be very frustrated to hear us discussing as if some threshold had not yet been met when they've already suffered so much.
Very important point taken, Shannon. That's exactly right. You know, when you're being rained on, even though it's only a 10% chance of rain, it's 100% on you. And I'm not belittling the events that have already taken place. I don't have a number or what have you. But again, when we start using weapons of mass destruction, large amount, small amount, what have you, the international community, as a community, has to say, are we going to allow this to continue forward? Because the next thing we start seeing is tactical nuclear weapons, which they have the ability to use, and then it goes down a very, very dangerous, slippery slope.
Now, you're saying that Syria also has nuclear weapons?
I'm saying that they have a capacity to use. You know, I'm not looking at strategic nuclear weapons, but tactical nuclear weapons, weaponized artillery shells that have a nuclear capability. I would not be surprised if they have that in their arsenal. They are a 50-year-old industrial age army that is a product of the Cold War, and I cannot think that they wouldn't have something like that was provided to them by the Soviet Union.
All right, so wherever you draw the line, let me ask a tough question for Paul. So, Paul, if you were President Obama, what would you do next in Syria?
Well, Michael, I think the answer to that question is premised on the simple fact that if the United States wants to remain a serious world power, we don't get to choose when we can take the field. We can't go home at halftime if we don't like the way the game is playing out. So there's 4 brief things that the Americans should begin to do. The first is to create and then articulate a concrete policy on Syria. Red lines on chemical weapons, hugely important. Turns out they're pink lines, but that's not a policy. We need to recognize there's 70,000 that are being killed. We have to do something about that on the humanitarian level. We need to realize that this conflict, even without the use of chemical weapons, is destabilizing a hugely important region. And we need to acknowledge that we have core national security interests. That's the first thing. Second thing, stop making unrealistic assessments regarding our limitations. We heard about the vaunted air defense of Syria. Somehow the Israelis never heard that story and haven't had trouble taking out issues and dealing with things that they have to deal with. We hear about, we don't want to put boots on the ground. Well, the policy or the non-policy that we're pursuing is leading to us to eventually have to put boots on the ground. Let's start talking about a negotiation backed by the threat of force. Let's put no-fly zones. Let's put safe havens back on the table. Third, we need to publicly acknowledge, as Shannon's pointed out, our moral obligation. U.S. foreign policy is still driven and should be by our moral obligations, and it's also driven by our core strategic interest in stopping al-Qaeda from taking up the field for the second half of the game once we've left the field. And then finally, we need to get serious about telling the Russians to get on board. I think Secretary Kerry's trip was a really good step in that direction, but we need to make it clear to the Russians that we have strategic interests which overlap with the Russians. If they don't see that, that's fine. But we have strategic interest. We're going to do everything in our power to get Assad to the table and have negotiations backed by the threat of force.
Now, Paul, you mentioned Secretary Kerry's trip to Russia. And apparently, from the news reports, the discussions were, let's try to get a negotiated settlement. Let's find some way other than prosecutions and regime change. Now, Paul, you've written a book called Peace with Justice, and I don't want to accuse you of being like Immanuel Kant when he said, this philosopher who famously said, we need to have justice even if the heavens will fall, right, Shannon?
That's right.
But what is the problem? You mentioned earlier we shouldn't have exile deals on the table, but if that's the price for peace and stability and not having more killing, why isn't that acceptable?
We live in a decade, we've lived in a couple of decades, Bosnia, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, Cambodia, of crimes against humanity and genocide. This is the fruit of impunity. You know, we had decades of impunity. What does it get you? It gets you atrocities. The reason we have the International Criminal Court, the reason we had the Sierra Leone Tribunal that Dave was the chief prosecutor for, is to break this cycle of impunity, which we do know leads to more atrocities. Let's try a little accountability and see if we can begin to reduce those atrocities. Giving amnesty. Sorry, go ahead, Michael.
Shannon was indicating that she wanted to chime in.
Well, I just wanted to point out that, I said earlier that some people view the death penalty as vengeance instead of justice, but the flip side of that is if Assad is seen to be let off too easily, given a safe exile, then justice again is not served. The victims have a right to see their perpetrator answer for his crimes and not to be seen to be flourishing somewhere, mocking their suffering.
And Paul, do you want to finish your thought?
Yeah, I agree with Shannon. We need to stop legitimizing these individuals and legitimizing their agendas, which are carried out through the use of force against civilians. We need justice, not only for the perpetrators, but we need justice for the victims. The victims need to, see that justice is being done, because that's not personal revenge, but that prevents personal revenge. Everyone who engages on Syria is worried about the day after, because Assad has taken what is a conflict seeking to topple his regime to bring about a democratic transformation and turned it into a conflict where he's pitting Syrian populations against Syrian populations. And the only way you're going to have reconciliation in the day after to stop personal acts of revenge is to have accountability for those who were responsible for starting it and keeping it going.
Now, Dave, this has all been in the abstract, but when you were the prosecutor of the Special Court for Sierra Leone, we saw this actually play out with Charles Taylor when he went into exile in Nigeria. Can you tell the listeners how that worked out?
Well, at the end of the day, justice was done and he was handed over. But for 2 years, I spent moving about capitals discussing what we're chatting about this afternoon, and talking to them that at the end of the day, we will not have a true peace unless true justice is done. And so that over time, that began to resonate. And he was eventually handed over for a fair and open trial. If we do not have Assad, if he survives the transition, if we do not try him, then the pain and suffering will just well up, vengeance will be in the streets, and we will have a further perpetration of atrocities on all sides as vengeance kicks in and justice flows down the drain.
Well, speaking of vengeance, Shannon, when Libya fell, the revolutionary forces grabbed Muammar Gaddafi and they murdered him on the streets. What do you think needs to be done to make sure that Assad and the other leaders are not murdered so that they can be brought to justice in a fair and an effective trial, as we've been discussing?
Well, I mean, there's the basic step that these folks will have to be taken into protective custody if possible, but that's, of course, easier said than done. I think the broader point is that the case has to be made. It has to be made strongly and persuasively that there is a good reason to take them into custody, because it only takes one angry victim to kill someone like Assad if they find them. And I'm actually reminded of the recent experience in the United States with the two alleged perpetrators of the Boston Marathon bombings, and how there was a broad argument made in the press and elsewhere that we needed to take the younger of the two brothers, who was still alive, into custody so that he could be questioned and more could be learned. And I think that case, having been made publicly, had a lot to do with him being taken alive.
So one of the things we need to do is to ensure that the international community, with one single voice, is saying that there needs to be justice, not revenge.
That's right. And I'd like to add that I recently was at a conference in Amsterdam with the group Euro-ISME, which is the International Society for Military Ethics. The theme of the entire conference was reconciliation. And over again, from many different countries and many different perspectives, we heard this point echoed, that reconciliation is not possible without justice. You have to start by bringing these folks in a very public way to justice before you can even begin to reconstruct those relationships.
But sometimes justice isn't enough. It tells a little tiny bit of the story, but not the full story. And Paul, I understand that your NGO has also been helping with the creation of a truth commission for Syria. What would that entail?
Well, Michael, what we've discovered is that the situation in Syria vis-a-vis the truth is actually not that complicated. It's pretty clear who's doing what, and as David had mentioned earlier, there's thousands of videos on YouTube. This is a whole new generation of information coming out. But what would really be helpful is an international truth commission. A truth commission headed by the Syrians, which looked at the murky role that some of these countries, the Russians, the Iranians, others, non-state actors, have been playing in this conflict supporting Assad, and the murky role of who's supporting al-Qaeda. There are some pretty scary things out here about the ability of al-Qaeda to basically engage in a very effective way. Where are they getting their support? So I'm thinking that, you know, oftentimes there's a truth commission to find out about disappearances and who was committing these atrocities. Oddly enough, we know that now. It's pretty clear out there. You can watch it on YouTube. But how they're being enabled by the internet, by those in the international community, that's where I think truth would be very important and very effective for a lot of the reasons Shannon's talking about in preventing revenge and in reconciliation and in healing.
Well, time has really flown, and it is time for us now to wrap the program up. Today, we've provided an expert appraisal of the prospects for justice if the Assad regime falls in Syria. Our experts seem to be of a consensus that it will eventually fall and that justice is both something that should be pursued and can be effectively pursued. As always, we hope we've shed light where before there was only heated debate. If you want to weigh in on the discussion or suggest a topic for an upcoming broadcast of Talking Foreign Policy, just send an email to talkingforeignpolicy@case.edu. I want to thank again the panel of experts we've had today, Judge Raid Juhi, the Chief Investigative Judge of the Saddam Hussein Trial, Shannon French of Case Western Reserve University, Paul Williams of the Public International Law and Policy Group, and David Crane, the former Chief Prosecutor of the Special Court for Sierra Leone. I'm Michael Scharf. Talking Foreign Policy has been brought to you by Case Western Reserve University in partnership with WCPN 90.3 Idea Stream.
Talking Foreign Policy is a production of Case Western Reserve University and is produced in partnership with 90.3 FM WCPN Idea Stream. Questions and comments about the topics discussed on the show, or to suggest future topics, go to talkingforeignpolicy@case.edu. That's Talking Foreign Policy, all one word, @case.edu.